that could incite some kind of outrage to say we should not be trying to keep kids in custody. But if we think about what these kids are actually doing, yes, they're committing crimes. Yes, they need to face consequences. But these are not hardened, malicious criminals who are a danger to the community in the type of danger that I would be afraid of.
Welcome to Crime Scene Gold Coast Part 2 with Liz Green, and Part 2 we're going to discuss the youth sentencing and swap some war stories, and I hope that you find it entertaining and continue to join us here at Guardian Criminal Law. So what special considerations do we currently take into account when sentencing youth?
Well, I mean, I guess for any sentencing, always it has to be offender specific. We don't have mandatory sentencing for anything apart from murder. We've got some mandatory minimums that apply.
Driving offences.
And unlawful striking, that sort of thing. But it is offender specific. And so really that just opens the door for anything relevant to be put before the court for the court to take into account. And so obviously things like their family circumstances, their, whether they've been subjected to any forms of neglect or abuse, anything at all that they have been able to point to show that they have prospects for getting back on track. That catchphrase, prospects for rehabilitation, is heard in every single sentencing, I would think. There wouldn't be a time where prospects for rehabilitation aren't considered. And there's been calls to have imprisonment as a last resort removed when it comes to juvenile offenders, because at the moment, the thinking is that if they can remain in the community, then that's going to be the best outcome for everyone, the offender and the community long term, because we can get them back on track, prevent them from committing future crimes. And we all know that sometimes when you go into prison, you come out a better offender than when you went in.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, that's right.
It's not the answer. But because of all of the publicity and some very shocking crimes perpetrated by youth offenders, the government is really tightening the laws. Things like bail being much more strict in terms of juvenile offenders, and this need to show that they're being punished means that I think at times those true considerations of what has led to the offending, what is the best course moving forward, get a little bit lost in the need to show that we're cracking down on youth offending and youth offenders.
So what do we do in our communities to assist our youth? I know of some really good programs that have been put together. There's a program in northern New South Wales where it's very difficult for some youth to get their driver's licence. So now you need like 120 hours. Yeah, and so you and I were talking about family earlier, so we've been through that with some of our kids already.
Yes.
And it's not easy to get that 120, it's 120 hours, or if you have a driving lesson, it's worth a few more hours. It can come down to 100 or something, can it?
Well, I'm very familiar. I'm about to start my third lot of learners in our family.
Yeah.
But if you can do 10 hours of lessons, and that will equate to 30 hours, but it's capped at that.
Okay. So what is it, 100 or 120?
Queensland's 100, I think.
I thought it was 120
Maybe
in New
it's
South Wales.
just been increased.
But it's not easy. And also the logbook wants to see a variety of conditions, day driving, night driving, in the wet.
Yeah.
And I think it's wonderful. I think it's a terrific thing to do to try to improve our young people's chances of surviving on the road and not having to deal with a tragedy like we've been speaking of. And it's very difficult. And in some of the remote communities, in northern New South Wales, there's no infrastructure in the little remote community. And so in order to just do anything basic like shopping, you have to drive to town. There's no public transport either. There might be a community bus that's on a Tuesday and a Thursday. But, you know, if you need something on Wednesday, you got to drive to town. And for health purposes, a whole range of reasons you have to drive. Yeah. And we find youth... they learn how to drive a vehicle when they're quite young, usually on and around the community where they're not getting in any trouble. Yes. So by the time they get to 16 or 17, they're quite capable drivers. And then a relative will say, you can drive me to town. And so they start off with drive unlicensed. And the court was quite receptive to the reasons for this occurring and wanted to try to assist the young people in getting a license. So quite often we'd adjourn the matter. And if we came back to the court with a learner's permit, then the court would adjourn the matter again and then allow for there to be some progress made with a view to the person coming back to the court with a driver's license and then imposing the penalty, which is not going to be a loss of license for them at that stage. So, so to try to get them there. But very, very difficult because you have to have somebody to go with you to do the 120 hours. So money was raised to buy a car for that purpose, and then you had to have somebody go drive with them. And the local police got involved, and the police officers were giving up their own time when they were not on shift to go and drive with the youth. And it was the Northern Region's commander who came to the meeting that we had when we were trying to get this off the ground with a list of police officers that had put their name down to assist.
It's amazing.
So it is amazing. We don't hear enough of that story.
No,
you know?
no.
The papers aren't picking that story up, you know, about how great the police are and working with other community services and the Aboriginal Legal Service and all that to try to bring about positive change. So everybody's trying. Everybody's trying to with the inputs, but it can be very difficult to bring resources to some of these more remote places.
Yeah.
And in my experience in the law, when we talk about domestic violence, yes, domestic violence occurs in every demographic, in every society, every part of our society. But there's definitely hotspots, and there's definitely red hot spots. Yeah. And when you look at the red hot spots, what's in common with them? Social and economic disadvantage.
Yeah.
Just screaming for it all the time. Whether the red hot spot is in Logan or whether it's in a remote Aboriginal community, that seems to be the common thread.
Yeah.
So with the kids breaking in and pinching the car and going and getting the food and all that stuff, if they had the resources to get the food and the cigarettes in the first place, would they have gone and pinched the car?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there would be those that would still do it.
Yes.
But would it be to the degree that we're seeing? Probably not. I think one of the things I read as I was looking through some materials was the suggestion or the legislation that came through for allowing for a tracker to be placed on a young offender if the court felt that was necessary while they were on bail. And that's quite a big thing. At the moment for adult offenders, it's very limited as to who can have a tracker placed on them. But so this legislation came in that said, yep, we can put them on juveniles and that will keep everyone happy because they're going to be monitored. So there was something like, I think it was $3.8 million allocated for that process. And in the first 12 months, I think it was, there were three trackers placed. The thinking was if they need a tracker, then actually they need to be in custody. And so there was just more people being held on remand. So it didn't really achieve its purpose. And you can't help wondering if that $3.8 million was channeled elsewhere before these kids are getting to the point where they need to apply for bail on charges, if that's not a better use of the money.
I know. And where do you send it? I think I've noticed there's a lack of cohesion between a lot of community services and more cohesion there would make for much better results. I've noticed that in many areas. Where do you put the money? I'm not sure. What I got frustrated with, Liz, was when I was dealing with youth criminal matters and children's criminal matters, you just so often sending the poor children back into the same environment that had the result that brought them to court. Yes. And then before you've even resolved that matter, there's another matter of like offending, because what do they say?
Because
It's like
nothing's
beating
changed.
Yeah, you're trying to get a different result, but you're not doing anything different, and so you're setting the kids back into that environment, and it's a very unhealthy one, and then they're back before the court. I saw I had a matter, Liz, that I should have actually documented this or kept some records of it, because I'd never seen anything like it. Young fellow, about 17, just before he's becoming an adult, and a repeat offender since he was like 8-9 years of age. And by the time I was dealing with him, his criminal record ran to 57 pages. And his father was in jail from when he was quite a young man, and he was mainly brought up by a grandparent. And that grandparent was an absolutely beautiful person and done everything that she possibly could have done. I mean, very, very tolerant and very patient. And I talked to some local police officers, and they made a comment that he was exactly like his dad. So I was able to go through material and source his father's criminal record. And when you put his criminal record and his father's criminal record side by side, it was like you're almost identical to the ages and the offences. Like, so the father's first sexual offence is when he's 15. This guy's first sexual offence is when he's 15. It was just those common factors repeating. So it was like Groundhog Day. Two individuals are put on the planet and are in the same, so they share a genetic traits. So sort of he's probably set up there, and then put in probably the same environment that his father was in, and exposed to the same factors, and has the same result.
Did he have contact with his dad?
Very little. Very little. His father was in jail for a long period for serious sexual offending, and his father's sexual offending started off when he was 15, and it was almost identical. When you read about the offences, they're almost identical, occurring at very similar ages, and coming out of the same environment.
I mean, we all know about the cycle of abuse. I don't know if he was a victim of his dad or not, but maybe in that environment he was exposed to abuse of some kind, and it does, perpetrate more offenders, which sort of is, you always think when you haven't been impacted by it, well, if you'd gone through it, why would you do that to someone else? But that, it's not as simple as that either.
It isn't. And there was another thing that you and I touched on when we first met earlier this week, and that was I spoke to you about an experience I'd had with high needs residential care kids. So these are young teenagers, all the way up to about 16, 17. They've been involved in the criminal justice system. Most of them have been to what they call juvie, or child detention. And most of them were diagnosed with some sort of mental health disorder like ADHD or oppositional defiance disorder. And most of these kids were on medication of some kind. And some of these medications are really strong medications, Liz. Going to be taken twice a day. And so in these resi care homes, there's some very strict rules. So there's 2 people on at all times. No sharp knives. So the knives, cooking knives, they're all locked in the safe for you to use, only you to use when you're going to cook. Right. There's a whole lot of these restrictions, a whole lot of things screaming out, you can't be trusted. Now, the record would show, and the evidence would show, that they do need some precautions to be put in place, because there have been some of the carers badly injured. Right. But the point that I wanted to make with you that I didn't bring up before was how angry some of these kids are. They're really, really upset. And they're upset because they haven't had what other children have had. And that came to mind with me because I remember an incident in particular where I was working at one of these facilities. And so what it looks like is just a house. It's a suburban house, usually a little bit out of the suburbs in a rural area on some acreage is what's preferred. And so it'll be a 4 or 5 bedroom house, and it's set up for shared accommodation for these kids. And so we'd have a a minibus that I'd take the kids in the morning. Some of the kids needed to go to school, so they need to be dropped off. Other kids had medical appointments or dental appointments, or wanted to go to the library, or wanted what they called free time, which was a really bad idea. You know? And I can recall dropping off one of the children at school, and I had about 3 or 4 of the other kids in the car, in the vehicle that weren't going to school. And there was a red Mercedes-Benz A-Class, a little hatchback 2-door compact Mercedes-Benz car. It was red, and there was a young girl sitting in there with a private school uniform on, and she had P plates on her car. And so, as you and I know, that's not an expensive car. It was an older one too. So obviously Mum and Dad have shelled out 10 grand or something to buy their daughter the safest and best car that they can afford, you know. And we as parents, that's the attitude that we take, you know. How much can we afford? What's the best we can do?
Yeah.
So, but this girl that was in the bus, she just, it got triggered that she just became extremely violent. It was a visceral response. She was smacking the windows of the bus with her hands, and she had lost control. It was like her eyes were going back in her head, and she was spitting as she was swearing and cursing. And she called this young girl everything under the sun and was screaming, "How come you've got it? How come I don't have anything and you've got everything? Look, you bitch, you're driving a fucking Mercedes-Benz and I've had nothing my whole life." Now, if that young lady was walking through the car park as this young girl was getting into her car with, you know, a bag of donuts or whatever from the shop before, you know, after school, before she's going to school or whatever she's doing.
Yeah. Disaster.
It could have been an absolute disaster that resulted in somebody being viciously assaulted, their car being stolen and wrecked. And so I saw that. So I recognised that sometimes it can be some sort of visceral response to some sort of trauma in the past that's triggered, and it can end up being an extremely bad situation.
Yeah, and I think that happens. I think that's the reality. But again, you know, how do you deal with that?
Through making sure that the girl in the bus has got resources and is brought up in a respectful and loving way. If she just went to school and had somebody that washed her clothes and made a meal and went to school with lunch and came home to somebody that was encouraging her and participating as well, you know, involved in life. That's
which is the ideal.
Different, yeah.
And it's what should be the case for every kid.
Yeah.
But the reality is so far from that, and yet the way to bridge it, it's not even just down to funding. It's issues with the system, you know, where kids who get taken from unsafe homes and are placed in foster care, and the foster carers might be doing the most amazing job, but then the parents like, well, we're good now, we can have the kid back. And so the kid goes back until the next issue with their parents. And so then I think that's potentially even more damaging, because they get this period of time where they do feel safe and they are being cared for, and then they're back with their parents and they love their parents for the most part. It's very hard to sever that bond. So the system itself also places so much recognition and hope in that family relationship, which just so often isn't borne out.
No.
And so it's a breakdown of so much. And it's the same, you know, with DV. Like, the issues are at the front end that need to be addressed, but they're so heavily ingrained in society that it's so difficult to pull it apart and start again.
I can appreciate that, but I think there are some, I just put this on the table. I think there are some simple things. There are really simple things that can be introduced into young people's lives that make a difference. And ideally, they're living in a loving environment with two parents who are raising them and providing a good example and plenty of resources and that sort of thing. That's the ideal, and, you know, that won't exist everywhere. But the government farms out a lot of this responsibility to private enterprise. So the high-res children, they are housed by private organisations. These are organisations sometimes with a religious base, so it might be a Catholic or Anglican run organisation. Sometimes they might be specific to an organisation specific to a particular group of people. So the one in Coffs Harbour that I worked with that's subsequently been disgraced was called Wandara, disgraced and deregistered. And so
for mistreatment?
Oh, yeah, and failure to allocate resources properly.
Right.
The people that were the directors of this private company, they spent the money on themselves. They had very lavish homes, brand new sports cars with, all matching in colour. The boat, the sports car, the caravan, the four-wheel drive, everything's got to be matching in colour and design, the best of everything. Now, I worked with this organisation for a few months and never, ever met the directors of the organisation and never, ever saw them attend on one of the residential properties there. They were permanently on holiday and enjoying themselves. And so their main concern was their own welfare. And so they built a business model. They get paid so much per child. And their idea is to maximise the profit, the bottom line. And my experience was I remember asking for an extra $20 a week so that I could put fresh fruit on the table for the kids, because I started doing that, and just a bowl of fruit on the table like most of us have. But these kids never had that. They never had help yourself. They never had that trust and responsibility. And so I'd put that fruit on the table and I'd notice after 2 days it was all gone, because when they walk past, they'll grab an orange or an apple or a banana or a pear, or if you've got it there, they'll grab it as they go past. And I asked for another $20 a week, and they told me that the kids like eating 2-minute noodles dry. So that was their idea of a snack for when they came home. They grab a packet of 2-minute noodles, they open it up, shake the seasoning in it, so not even with water, and then eat that. And so there's one small improvement that could be made. Make sure that there's monitoring of the dietary intake of the children and that it's done with proper care and love, and food placed on the table so you can help yourself and you can share your fellow diners at the table. Turn the TV off, sit down together.
Family dinner.
That's being lost in that's not the norm these days, Liz, I've learned. The norm seems to be some sort of food hits an area in the kitchen, people attend on that area, grab their food and then go to their respective areas in the house where they engage in their personal device. And that seems to be quite a normal process these days.
I don't know. You're probably the same, but I feel like my career has definitely informed the type of parent that I became. And so I guess you hear themes when you're sitting in court as to what may have led to the offender appearing in court. What are some commonalities that you can pick out from their youth or from their past? And I guess I worked very hard to ensure that, that wasn't happening. And so we do have family dinner, and I'm quite strict about, my kids have screens, they're on them a lot, but I'm strict about not in the bedrooms. And, the things that have informed me, I was very strict about sleepovers when my kids were little, just things like that. But if you're not exposed to those elements that can cause such detriment, then I guess that ignorance means you're not actively working to avoid it. And so I think that is becoming more common. And life is busy, and both parents are working, or it's a single parent home and the time for family dinner isn't available. There's so many factors. I just think there's so much at work that undermines it.
It does, absolutely does. I'd just put this out there. I am of the opinion that any organisation that's going to be responsible for restricting your liberty, so correctional facilities, youth detention facilities, I don't think they should be privatised. I think that we as a community need to take responsibility for those really important institutions, and they should be run by the nation on behalf of the nation, not given to a corporate entity whose legal responsibility is ongoing growth and distribution of increasing profits to shareholders. And so we're replacing the humanity with a piece of paper, something that's, I think there was a term about corporations having no body to incarcerate and no soul to rehabilitate. And so we're putting a body that's got no body to incarcerate, so they can't suffer a penalty for that sort of penalty, and no soul to rehabilitate, so because it's just a cold company on paper, and yet we're putting them in charge of the souls that we wish to keep out of incarceration and we wish to rehabilitate. And the two, I don't think, are a good match because the priorities are so far removed.
And I would agree with that. But it comes back to funding. Like the government bodies who do have responsibility for things, they're already, underfunded and understaffed. And that, like I've got a good friend who she's a social worker. She was with Department of Families for a long time. And she loved her job, but she was just beaten down by it because there was never enough money or staff, and they could see all the need that was out there.
There's not enough money or staff, but how come there's enough money to pay a private corporation to do the job?
Well, I do not have the answer to that, Mark, but I think...
Now, you know of Serco? Serco, a British company, international company, and their specialisation is to run corrective facilities all around the world.
Okay.
They're very, very experienced in running correctional centres. Serco are in Australia now, and I was involved in the community consultation with the construction of the new jail in northern New South Wales that I say was purposely built for Serco. They put it out to tender. It was Serco all the time. Nobody else appeared except for Serco. Serco appeared on the scene in Grafton and conducted a range of community consultations, and I was involved as part of that. And I sat down with Serco, and it would have been fantastic to film this meeting. They are cold-blooded. Like they are absolutely cold-blooded and expert. They are so expert in what they do. So they have to spend a certain amount of money in the community, and I think it was a large amount. I think it was tens of millions of dollars. They had to go into community projects that were designed to prevent recidivism and assist in reduction of the crime rate. And that's just a premium that they have to pay in order to operate the jail. So that's an injection into the community. I think it was spread around to different bodies in the community at Serco's discretion, and I think there was some guidelines, like it had to be a community service.
Right.
Now, I sat down to a meeting with Serco, and present was some sort of development officer and a young lady, very attractive young lady, who had been in the prison system. She was involved with drugs, living on the street. I think there was some prostitution. They talked to me about her background, and he drags her around in the consultations as an example of what their organisation can do. Look at this person, was so downtrodden and everything, and we've rehabilitated her such that we now employ her, right? And it's all just a show. It's all just a show. She's a lovely young lady. And then they tried to explain to me how Serco's main vision was to work themselves out of a job. That's what their vision was, to be that effective as rehabilitators and good guys in the community that they would be working themselves out of a job. Now, they've been doing this for decades. And when I asked the question where they have been successful in achieving that aim, well, it very quickly comes back that they've never been successful in achieving that aim, but that's what they'd like to see happen, and they work towards that, rehabilitation programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The rehabilitation programs are nearly non-existent. You can't contact the education officer. The education officer is spread between 3 Serco facilities around New South Wales. There's no chance. I think that the figure was about $1,800 a day per prisoner that they get. So it's in their best interest to be as full as possible and to keep the prisoners there for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Now, my first experience after that opened, now we're talking about an organisation with decades of experience in this area. They are the leading developer of systems in this area because they pour their money into making more money in the bottom line. So how can we streamline everything upstream from there so that we get the most, cash at the end of the day? And so one of my first experiences was I went to court in Grafton. My client was in custody at the new Serco facility. My client was granted bail at that application, the release application that I made, on the basis that he'd already been in custody for a longer term that he would be sentenced to.
Yep.
It's just unjust to keep him there for 1 day longer. It was ridiculous. 5 days later, the family called me and said, he's still there. They still have not released him after 5 days. I could see the look on your face. Yep. And usually the client's released on that day, unless it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes it'll drift over to the next day. But I think it's legislated that it's as soon as practicable that they must be released.
Yes.
And in my experience, sometimes the paperwork can drag out for a couple of hours, but it's usually not more than that. 5 days.
That's insane.
On my inquiry, the staff refused to tell me who the head of the correctional centre was so that I could directly communicate with them, refused to provide me with a contact number for that person or an email for that person.
On
That
what
person,
basis?
I don't know. It's like fully protected. Like they will not allow you at all. And then told me that he was still there because there was a glitch in their system. That was the answer. There's a glitch in my system. Liz, I don't think we should be privatising these responsibilities that are so critical to a healthy community to give these people who we desperately want to rehabilitate. We want them to bring their talents to our community, and then we farm it out to a multinational corporation that has a proven track record of massive profits, ongoing growth for their shareholders. Surely that should bar them from being involved in such a critically important humanitarian activity.
Oh, well, I mean, that
So
story is shocking.
There's your start.
Yeah.
Say no to the private contractors. Here's my commie coming out. And say, let's pour the resources into this to make our community better. Because I'm sure the government look at it as something they'd prefer to avoid, and the corporations look at it as a fantastic way to generate great profits.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to argue with you on that point.
So anyway, that's what I'm saying. Where we're saying, where do we start? I'm saying we should start by having it government funded, government run, and the priority being the rehabilitation of the individual.
Which is what it's meant to be.
That's right.
So, I'm sure there are those who say that is the system, that the focus is on rehabilitation. I mean, I said earlier that you won't have a sentence hearing where rehabilitation is not brought up, but we're also getting, a lot more cases where incrementally penalties are increasing. So then our precedents are for higher penalties, and it's just that creep to more imprisonment and less true focus on rehabilitation. And I think it does come back right to where we started, to community expectations or disillusionment with the system, which I think is underpinned by a lack of understanding. So, that's also something I think needs to be.
How do we improve community understanding?
I don't know, because, I mean, as a teacher of criminal law, every semester, without fail, when I have sentencing as a topic, I start out and I get my students to find a media report that has talked about a sentence that has happened recently. Tell me what they think of it. Do they think it was fair? Do they think that the court made the right decision? And not 100%, but 90% of them are about courts being too lenient. You know, this wasn't fair for the victim.
Mm.
I then teach them the law. I teach them what goes into a sentence hearing, and they do. I give them a brief that's been adapted from a court file, and they appear as prosecution or defence, and they make submissions on sentence. And then, you know, we'll do a finish off where we talk about what we think of sentencing. And the difference in perspective from that first lecture through to the end is every semester phenomenal.
Okay.
And so then you talk to the students and they're like, oh, I never realised this, or I didn't understand that, or it makes so much more sense. When I read the paper now, I'm like, but did you think about this? You know, and so that's obviously, these are people who are interested in the law. They want to study it. They may not want to do criminal law, but they have that base understanding and interest. I think everybody needs to have that understanding, because how can you ever have faith in the system if you're not really sure what's going on?
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be, we have a transparent system. People can go and listen to most sentences. They can apply for transcripts, you know, that there is facility for that sort of thing to happen. But people in the community aren't going to go to that length. They're going to read
That's right.
the articles, take what they get from that, and then have opinions. And they're mostly uninformed opinions.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. I was in court this morning with a lovely couple, mature-aged couple, first interaction with the criminal justice system, very minor charges, just a common mistake that anybody could make and end up before the court on a minor matter. So, but they were really nervous about the whole process, and it was very important that I met them and that I took them into the building. They were very intimidated by the whole scene. And then I think that what occurred today in court was very much outside the realms of their expectation. And so where their expectation came from is probably the television, the newspaper. And so when I walk into court and I can speak freely with prosecution, and we'll make a decision about how we'll progress the matter that day, they came away from it today going, wow, that was totally different to what we expected. Wow, that was I forget the words that they used, but it expressed their surprise at how things actually worked.
Yes.
But I myself have been very guilty of that, Liz, of having the wrong impression. So when I was at Bond University, where you're now teaching, and I was in my first moot court, so that's a court that's set up it's a simulated courtroom environment where we practice being in court. And I remember the first moot that I was in, and it was my turn to cross-examine a witness, and I confidently stepped out from behind the bar table and approached the dock where the witness was sitting.
No.
And I forget which. It might have been William Van Koningen.
Oh, yes.
He was a South African man that did constitutional law.
He's still there.
Is he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it might have been him, and just said to me, Mr. Savic, you're not in the United States.
That's it.
And so my perceptions were wrong, and here's me, first year law student. So how do people get informed? Because our courtrooms, like you said, are open to the public. They're open to the public. Anybody can go and have a look. I don't find them necessarily intimidating places, but maybe it's because I work there all the time. But
you're used to it.
If you're a member of the public, go and get and sitting down.
Well, I always recommend my students go and watch an actual sentence hearing before they come and do their assessment. And they all come back and they say, oh my goodness, I forgot to nod when I went in, or it was so quiet in the courtroom, or the bailiff was giving me the evil eye because I was rustling my papers, and they're not there for any crime or for anyone who's going through the system. They're just there to observe, and it's still intimidating.
Okay.
So,
well, look, when I first started, what were you like when you first went to court? How did that feel?
Well,
can you remember?
I do. I do remember. And my tell when I'm nervous is that my knees shake. So I have always done public speaking and debating and speech and drama at Stedfords. My knees always shake. And when you're on a stage, very hard to hide shaking knees. But when you're at a bar table, not too bad. So I always came across quite composed, and I would hold on to the lectern.
Yeah.
But my knees would be shaking, 9 to the dozen. And that never stopped. It didn't matter how many times I appeared in court.
Right.
When I first stood up for that first appearance in the morning, I would have those nerves, because it is such an imposing and important place to be. And as a young prosecutor as well, you feel I felt very much, this is a big responsibility. I'm
Yes.
telling the judge what they need to know, and it's someone's real life and a victim who wants an outcome. It's a lot. So I was always nervous, but I loved every minute. But yeah, I know.
I was terrified. And when you just said your knees shaking, that I just thought I can picture it, because I remember the first matter that I had. I wasn't particularly smart in my career choice early on. I went to the bar very early, and I did a barrister's pupillage with Mr. Peter Darwin, who was a senior criminal lawyer here at the Gold Coast. He's since passed, and he was a very nice man to me. And the first job I got was representing a fellow barrister in a drink drive matter.
Oh my goodness.
So he'd got a mid-range, I think, drink drive, and he gave it to me mainly out of pity, I think, because I needed some work, and there was a little bit of cash for the young barrister on the floor, so he could afford a couple of drinks or something. And I remember standing up, and I could see the pants on my leg was shaking from my legs shaking. I was so incredibly nervous.
Yeah.
And then was for a long, long time. And I think that something very important had happened at a stage. So when I first started, we have an adversarial system, and I was adversarial. And then you start to learn that there's more to it than that, and it's a big responsibility. I started to look at it as a really big privilege to be in my community, entrusted with such important work. And so it was very important to get it right. And then you realise that you're working with some really awesome women and men in prosecutions, in the police force, in the judiciary, probation and parole, correctives. There's so many people that give so much of their life, they sacrifice for public duty.
Yes.
To try to improve everybody's lives. And then I realised, wow, I'm part of this. I'm not here to upset it or disturb it. I'm here to help it to develop properly and to work properly and to get the right outcomes for my client,
Yes.
my community. And you realise you've got these duties to the court that are just as important as the duties to your client. We can argue about that all day back and forth. That's a classic old argument. Who do you owe your duty to more, the court or your client? And I think, I'm not sure that it should be looked at in that way. They're different sorts of duties, and they're both as important as each other in order to make the whole work properly.
Yes. I think, I teach that from the prosecution perspective, you're not there to serve the victim. You're there to serve justice. And I was speaking about one of my bosses in the DPP who then, after 12 years, went to the bar. And I said to her, how on earth are you doing this? How are you going from prosecution to defense?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, Liz, it's, everyone's entitled to a defense. I'm still serving the courts, but I'm making sure that this person has their voice, And so I always thought, if the evidence is there, there'll be a conviction. And if there's not, there won't be. And it doesn't always work like that. You can't predict a jury. And I think our Bean Lee juries were expert at keeping us guessing. We could never be sure we had a slam dunk. But then you do have the appeals process. So there is a second chance to make sure that justice is being served. So I think it is this idea of not winning or losing a case, but making sure you are fulfilling your role to the system.
Absolutely. And I when I realised that, my work took on a different meaning, and for some reason those nerves were replaced by something else. It's still a feeling of some sort of excitement, but it's very positive. It's very, very positive. My favourite place is the courtroom.
Yeah, I love court.
I love the outdoors, but when I'm working, I love being in the courtroom. I could work in the courtroom all day quite happily. When I was first starting out, it was just petrifying.
Yeah.
It was very, very scary, very scary. So on that youth sentencing, so we should be trying to avoid sending the youth to full-time custody as much as possible. It should be a last choice, shouldn't it?
I think it should. And again, if we come back to statistics, the types of offences that are being committed by the majority of youths are not the serious ones. I've got my little paperwork here.
Yeah.
But so children who are being sentenced, the most common offences are unlawful entry, willful damage, stealing, trespass. The charges like robbery, indecent treatment of children, attempted robbery, rape, arson, those ones that we recognise as our most serious types of offences. So this is out of 2,229 cases, 75 involved those more serious charges. So it's a really small number overall.
And the other offences that you spoke about, I'm really familiar with a lot of those offences and with youth perpetrating those offences. And I just wanted to interrupt you because I just want to give an example so that our audience can understand. So when you say, you break and enter into a place and willful damage, and so here's a case that I had of that, right? 3 kids, all around 7, 8, 10, like young kids. They broke into a local childcare centre. They live in an environment where they've got nothing and nobody. There's nobody looking after them. And the breaking in was the willful damage because I think they broke a couple of fence palings and then they jimmied a door open. And when the police arrived, they were drinking the poppers from the fridge and playing the games in the centre, So I just want our audience to know that these are not kids breaking in and taking things to sell to buy a Ferrari. This is very subsistence and looking for things that our children, your children and my children have as a normal matter of course.
Yeah.
Sorry, Liz, to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. No, so I mean, the point is that, that could incite some kind of outrage to say we should not be trying to keep kids in custody. But if we think about what these kids are actually doing, yes, they're committing crimes. Yes, they need to face consequences. But these are not hardened, malicious criminals who are a danger to the community in the type of danger that I would be afraid of. Like, of course I don't want my car to get taken or, the graffiti or whatever. Like, it's not pleasant, it's not good, but to actually be at risk of serious harm from the majority of the juveniles, they're not the ones who are posing that risk.
No. And the juveniles that I was looking after, those high need residential kids, in the area that I was working that had quite a big population, the total number of those high needs residential kids in that area was about 15. So it's not a big number, but they're the ones that have been the most damaged, and it's usually trauma, and they're the ones that are involved in some of those more serious crimes.
Yes, and I mean, I do want to emphasise that I think that the youth who are committing the more serious offences and the ones who are being deliberately violent, whether or not there are drugs involved, whether or not they've got trauma or disadvantage, those kids who are making those choices do need the consequences that recognize the seriousness of their crimes. Like I'm still very much in support of just punishment as a concept, but it's too easy in this current climate to say juvenile offenders are the worst and they need harsher penalties, because that's not the answer.
No. And what are the recent changes with regard to criminal responsibility, Liz? There have been some with regard to age.
So that's an ongoing issue.
To lift the age of criminal responsibility, isn't it, to 14?
To 14, which...
But it always has been, hasn't it?
Well, no. So anyone from the age of 10 can face criminal charges. But if they're aged 10, 11, 12, 13, the prosecution has to prove to the court that they appreciated that what they were doing was wrong. So it's this concept called dolly in capax.
Yep.
And so unless and until the prosecution can establish that this particular 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old appreciated or was aware of the fact that they were doing wrong, then they can't be charged.
Exactly, yeah.
But they are charged. Like a lot of kids aged between 10 and 14 face charges. But for a majority of those, it would be a reprimand or some kind of intervention as a consequence. But so to raise the age of criminal responsibility to 14 actually just brings us in line with international standards and expectations. Australia has been advised by the international community on more than one occasion that we should raise the age to 14 at least. There are many jurisdictions where the age of criminal responsibility is over 14. New Zealand recently changed their laws. You can still be charged if you're under the age of 14, but only for very serious offences. So there is room to address that human rights issue, which is what it is, for children of tender age to be charged. I think we can't ignore the fact that there are kids under the age of 14 who do, on occasion, commit heinous crimes. So the facility to still take action against those is probably something that can be on the table. But if we change our focus from punishment and detention for kids up to the age of 14 to care and rehabilitation in some way that doesn't involve the courts, then that will hopefully end up with kids who are better for the community overall.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I practiced it in an area once where I was dealing with quite a lot of young people, 10, 11, 12. And that dollar incapax argument was not being run. It was like foreign to the solicitors that were working in that area and to the prosecution at the time.
But they'd just be charged.
Children were being charged and that argument was not being run, so they were being charged. And so I noticed that as soon as I started practicing, and so I started using that argument, and it was 100% successful for a short period of time. And then what the police introduced was a standard questioning process in the interview process where they go through to establish that the individual knows what's right from wrong and provide them with some examples, and then they respond to those. So the police very quickly negatived most of my capacity to run that argument. But it still left, some young people where I did run the argument.
Well, and I also think, honestly, when we look at the youth of today, and I sound so old when I say that, but when you look at what they're exposed to from a young age in terms of internet access and exposure to things that we would never have had exposure to it at those ages because there wasn't the availability to access that sort of stuff. Like, the stuff that gets put on TikTok, people committing offences and posting it on TikTok, for example, the reach of that starts as young as however young parents let kids have TikTok. So knowing what's right and wrong, I think, is easier to prove at a young age now than it ever was.
Yeah.
So
the other thing that would concern me is that I saw a lot of young people who had been going through the system and with the magistrates and prosecution that I worked with, everybody was trying to keep the young people out of full-time custody, or what they called control orders. But once the individual had gone into full-time custody in juvenile detention, it was like they joined a club. Like it was almost like some sort of initiation or something that they passed. The attitude would change, because I'd never had one young person come out of juvenile detention and say, that was absolutely terrible. I'm definitely not going back there. I've learnt my lesson. They come back, they go into the same shitty environment. They're really bitter and twisted. They've been hardened up inside juvie because they've been bullied and they've had to protect themselves, and all sorts of things have occurred to them. And they end up becoming hard. And then when you go to court and it looks like there's got to be a control order, it's like met with, I don't give a fuck. I'm going to go see Barry and Jono, you know? And so it's not working.
Oh, no.
Whatever they're doing inside there in the system's not working. And when you go to some of the youth detention centres, Liz, the staff to inmate ratio is massive. The car parks are full of cars. There looks like there's lots of resources inside. So I'm not sure. I think it's got something to do with the very bad home environment. You know, you pull them out of the juvie, send them home. They've probably got better meals and more peace at juvie. And then they'd be angry because they're being sent back into the same environment where they've suffered trauma. So there seems to be a whole lot of anger.
But even more disadvantaged now because they've got a record.
That's right.
They've been out of school.
That's right.
They don't have the capacity to get a job. You know, all of that impacts it. I just thought of a funny story that's not relevant to anything.
Good. Let's finish on the funny story.
Talking about whether or not prison works. I've got a friend who works on the parole board, and they had a bikie who had been sentenced for a very serious assault, and he'd beaten up one of his own motorcycle gang because he found out he had indecently dealt with one of the kids, and he was furious, and so he just let this guy have it, and so he's in prison. And he came up for parole, and they heard all of the submissions, and then they said, and was there anything you would like to tell us? And he's like, yes, actually, I want to talk in my own behalf. And they're like, yes, go ahead. He goes, I just want you to know that I think prison has worked for me. And they're like, oh, okay, why do you say that? He goes, well, last week I found out that one of the new guys was a kiddie fiddler and I didn't bash him. And he thought that was all the parole board needed to let him go back out into the community.
Yeah. Wow.
So changes everything.
Yeah. Geez, a lot of that goes on in jail too.
Oh, yeah. I would not want to be there.
No, we don't want our youth to go there either.
No, we don't. We don't.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for coming and spending time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. We're enjoying bringing you these podcasts on a weekly basis, and we look forward to bringing you many more. We've got a Patreon page where you can subscribe. That'll assist us in bringing you future episodes, and also any money raised through that goes towards a youth help program that we're running. We look forward to your company for many months to come. Thank you.